Hello students and welcome to today's class. In the series of lectures on the Neolithic Revolution and the development of agriculture, in previous lectures we have looked at certain aspects and geographical locations from where agriculture emerged. In today's lecture we will be talking about the diffusion of agriculture to certain other areas which were left in the previous couple of lectures. The objectives of today's lecture are understanding the origins of agriculture in different parts of the world, locating various ways of transmission of this agricultural technology from one center to many peripheries and if there are any, and understanding the eco-factual evidences from many archaeological sites in the regions of Anatolia and South Africa. First, we will be talking about the evidences of food production in the regions of Anatolia. From the beginning of the Holocene, Anatolia, which is the modern day Turkey, offered a variety of advantageous highland and lowland environments for human settlements. Although archaeological studies in this area are still in its infancy, food production presumably started in this area at the same time it did in the Levant. The earliest discoveries are made from the southeastern parts. The tableland in the Urfa region of southeast Turkey is drained by the upper sections of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. It is a region of limestone hills that are arid and dry with wet winters and hot, dry summers. The region's varied soils once supported wild cereal stands in their original state, but later this region was made feasible for farming. DNA analysis has identified this region's Karakadag mountains as the original habitat of the cultivated ayan corn. The oldest known farmed ayan corn in the world, which dates to 9400 BCE, was recently discovered in the still inhabited city of Sanli Urfa, Yeni Mahalle in southeast Turkey. In the Urfa, farming was practiced from very early times. There must have been centuries of cereal growing experiments here as well as in the Levant during a protracted drought. A wide variety of grinders and other grain processing tools as well as the use of primitive technologies were still essential for hunting, foraging and at least some farming. However, society was also undergoing significant changes in other areas as seen by the astonishing development of spiritual beliefs and social customs which was mirrored in the expansive communal institutions. Some of these structures can be seen in places like Muirbet in Syria as well as in village locations in the Urfa region. The settlement at Sayano Tepesi in southeast Turkey was inhabited from roughly 8600 to 7000 BCE and is situated on a terrace above a small river with the rectangular homes standing close to the river. They curve into an arc with a sizable open area in the middle. There used to be three quite different buildings in this square. One of them was constantly being renovated and underneath one end of the structures were three stone built cells that were stuffed with human bones. More than 40 human skulls were found in one cell. In addition, this, what is known as the House of the Dead, yielded a flat stone slab that had stains of both animal and human blood, suggesting that some of the deceased were probably sacrificed. The deceased were either sacrificial war prisoners or were part of the ancestral ceremonies. The question cannot be answered due to the gap in our knowledge of early religious practices in this region. In the cells were at least 400 people's remains. Another of the public structures was almost square with tall stone monoliths embedded in the floor and a floor formed of tiny stones pressed into plaster. Such ornamented uprights may have supported the roof, but they undoubtedly served other purposes as well. Nowhere do such structures achieve greater elaboration than at Göbekli Tepe, which is famous for insights into the flamboyant beliefs of the early farmers. What are we to make of these remarkable locations, which appear to be in the transitional period between food production and hunting and gathering? They imply that in this area, complex rituals and early forms of social organization existed even before agriculture. The religious beliefs underlying these early engravings, according to human cognition researcher whose name is Stephen Methan, may have even been the catalyst for the development of farming. A similar argument is put forward by Göbekli's excavator, whose name is Klaus Schmidt, who claims that the enormous, likely ritual buildings at Göbekli were built with a great deal of labor and coordination, and that this same site may have been crucial in the transition from hunting to agricultural practices. Suddenly, dozens if not hundreds of individuals would have been needed to complete the intricate construction and ritual activities at each of the aforementioned archaeological sites. Large amounts of wild grain would have been needed to feed them, some of which would have fallen to the ground, germinated and then been gathered once more, a process which can be known as the domestication. Some of the superior grain from Karakadag would eventually have been transported home and traded with other towns, possibly as far away as Jericho, along with obsidian and seashells. It is still up for question whether the younger Dryas drought played a significant role in the transition, but this proposal offers a speculative alternative. Whatever the driving force behind the region's early food production, we can be certain that it had a significant impact on society's intricate relationship with the environment and the cosmos. Now let us talk about one of the very important Neolithic sites in Turkey, which is known as Çatalhöyük, and this settlement is regarded as one of the earliest villages of the human history. At Çatalhöyük, which is located on the western side of the Anatolian plateau, we have the best opportunity to understand how early farmers lived and worked there. Since the end of the last ice age, this region has been an important source of obsidian for the manufacture of tools. It was also an early hub for the production of food. Villages began to thrive in the places near major outcrops as early as 8300 BCE. The abundant obsidian sources in the Lake Van and elsewhere were conveniently located near the majority of Neolithic settlements in central and eastern Anatolia, making them easy to access. The fine stone was utilized almost entirely for the creation of artifacts in communities that were located in close proximity to the volcanic flows from which it originated. These villages also traded a significant amount of obsidian to communities that were located further away in the form of prepared blade cores. A relatively insignificant amount of Anatolian obsidian made its way along the eastern Mediterranean coast and into the Persian Gulf. This journey covered hundreds of miles. Trace element examinations of artifacts from many different sites demonstrate that the patterns of exchange were extremely complicated as different sources came into and went out of vogue. This complexity was due to the fact that different sources were in fashion at different times. By the year 7500 BCE, some of these early farming communities were already boasted of tightly packed dwellings that had been inhabited for 1000 years. At that time, there were a number of settlements similar to Çatalhöyük, located in central Anatolia. However, none of them had been investigated to the same extent as was Çatalhöyük. The massive Neolithic mound located at Çatalhöyük East spans an area of 13.7 hectares. It was a big village or town consisting of multiple small buildings made of sun-dried bricks that were constructed to back onto one another. Occasionally, these houses were divided from one another by small courtyards that included areas designated for the placement of maidens. The ceilings of these houses were flat and the exterior walls served as a practical barrier for defense. The town was rebuilt at least 18 times during a period of 1400 years, most likely as the buildings began to fall apart or the population increased. The most recent habitation of the area occurred around 6000 BCE. A large-scale excavation of the site is currently being carried out by a group of researchers from different countries. At Çatalhöyük, the people who lived there never constructed any large public buildings, ceremonial centers, or specialized production sectors. They also did not place their dead in cemeteries when they died. The houses were the centers of activity for all aspects of daily life, whether they were secular or associated with some kinds of rituals. To date, 166 homes have been unearthed, some of which were found to be clustered together in small areas and surrounded by middens or narrow alleyways. This gives the impression that these homes once shared ancestral burial grounds and possibly were related to one another also. The careful excavation of house sequences has left no room for question that the same groups of people occupied the same buildings despite the fact that they had never been rebuilt for many generations. The inside of several of the houses have been elaborately decorated with works of art that feature intricate symbolism. The Neolithic settlement at Çatalhöyük is contemporary with pre-pottery Neolithic B and later farming cultures found elsewhere in southwestern Asia, as well as it is a rich collection of knowledge on the spiritual life of the people. There are paintings of humans and even deadly creatures, burials in many of the buildings, and occasionally detachable skulls of the dead that have been removed after death. Additionally, there are installations of animal body parts such as bull horns on the walls and benches, skulls of humans and even bulls that had been preserved in plaster were passed around and deposited on significant occasions such as the construction of a new home. Skulls of ancestors were handed down from one generation to the next as part of a significant and long-standing tradition. All of this points to a multifaceted world of myths and meanings that were known throughout a wide area. Ian Hodder, a world-known archaeologist, and his colleagues discovered a complete blurring between the secular and the symbolic when they mapped the findings and features in the buildings, including the deposition of things that evoked memories of the past, including parts of figurines in hearths or foundations. A possible medium for communicating with the dead was the use of obsidian in floorboards and wall paintings. In the words of Ian Hodder, and I quote, "The lived-in houses were religious in the sense that they were about imagining, remembering, and interacting with past houses and those who had lived in them." Unquote. The average number of people living in a home at Çatalhöyük was between 5 and 8. But a small number of homes include the remains of far more than those that could have lived there. In one example, 62 bodies were found in a home that had been used by the same family for some 40 years. Evidently, persons who never lived in these special structures were laid to rest inside them. The dwellings were meticulously rebuilt on top of one another over extended time periods, with each new layer featuring a more complex symbolic meaning. Every one of these buildings held significance to its residents. In fact, it was not uncommon for them to dig the foundations of older homes in search of the bull skulls that were buried. Teeth from older graves were interred with those of a later reconstruction. These structures, which the researchers have dubbed as the history houses, are not monetarily distant from the other homes, but they do have a status that may have involved control over history, religion, and access to the relatives. It is possible that they also played a significant role in ritual feasts honoring wild bulls, which were associated with myth and spirituality. Even though some kin groupings in Çatalhöyük enjoyed more prestige than others, the society as a whole was likely still egalitarian, and houses may have provided and even controlled rituals for a larger kin group. The metaphorical word of Çatalhöyük is far too complex for us to ever aspire to replicate it in any but the broadest of colors. Judging from the earlier Göbekli Tepe site, with its monoliths adorned with humans and even animals, and other sites, a suite of themes including human skulls and birds of prey, wild cattle, etc., circulated widely around Southwest Asia during the time when people moved into big villages and small towns and took up agriculture. Artifacts and various artistic forms from diverse locations show that people all over an enormous region had a common set of myths, concepts, and symbolic acts and beliefs as they grew more and more rooted in the soil. People began forming these ties when they established themselves in the communities where social order became increasingly paramount. These were committed relationships with the individual histories, which may have been memorialized in the form of history houses, an architectural style whose origins may lie in the era before agriculture. Human and animal ancestors guarded the graves, the home, and the inhabitants. The strong notion of continuity that was important to living in civilizations whose routines focused around the endless passages of the seasons included associations between frightening wild creatures, headless humans, and even birds. Due to its monopoly on the commerce of obsidian volcanic glass from quarries in neighboring mountains, Çatalhöyük enjoyed considerable affluence. After 9000 BCE, however, farmers in Southwest Asia traded a wide variety of resources, including obsidian. Many barter exchanges were used to transport marine shells, jadite, serpentine, turquoise, and many more exotic goods from one village to another. It is possible that these frequent transactions served to strengthen interpersonal ties in addition to providing access to rare goods. This extensive flow of raw materials hastened the development of a variety of inventions, including the invention of pottery, sheep herding, and finally copper and bronze metallurgy. By analyzing bits of the volcanic glass found in hundreds of archaeological sites between Turkey and Mesopotamia using spectrographic techniques, it has been demonstrated that how significant the obsidian trade was in this region. By using this research, it is feasible to pinpoint the natural origin of the glass and to reconstruct the distribution of obsidian from numerous locations because the trace elements in obsidian are so distinctive. Thousands of obsidian samples show that this most prized of tool making stones was traded throughout Anatolia and far into the Levant. As one moves further from the resource area, the percentages of obsidian rapidly decrease, indicating that a large portion of early farming trade likely took the form of down-the-line bartering to move different goods from one village to another. Now let us turn to the continent of Africa and see what was happening in Egypt and the sub-Saharan Africa. Throughout the late Ice Age and for many millennia later, the Nile Valley provided a fertile environment for the hunter-gatherers. The abundance of game, fish and plant foods allowed hunter-gatherer tribes to spend the majority of the year in base camps. Wheat and barley were not cultivated along the Nile until 6000 BCE. By this time, humans were herding both cattle and goats or sheep on the semi-arid grasslands of the Saharan plains. According to some researchers, domestication of cattle from wild oxen occurred independently in North Africa or the Sahara at the same time it did in the Near East. Some of these nomadic herders went into the Nile Valley and assimilated with the local populace as the Sahara dried up around 6000 BCE. 2000 years later, upstream from the Nile Delta to Aswan at the first cataract and all the way into Nubia, which is the modern day Sudan, little farming settlements grew prosperous. The farmers took advantage of the regular Nile floods to cultivate winter crops while grazing their livestock close to the waters. The later civilization of ancient Egypt was built on this local farming culture. Cattle herders were grazing their herds in what is now the Sudan by 3500 BCE, hundreds of miles upstream. Some of these herders traveled as far south as the East African highlands 1500 years later, and they are eventually the ancestors of present-day cattle herding groups like the Maasai. The rising aridity of Sahara prompted this shift and others to the west. Many of these tribes, as well as fishermen living near lakes and rivers, raised crops that required summer rains and were domesticated from local cereals such as finger millet and sorghum. The staples of agriculture in tropical Africa were to be these crops. By at least 2000 BCE, cereal agriculture was being practiced on the southernmost ridges of the Sahara. People who lived on the periphery of the West and Central African rainforests have been replanting wild yam tops for thousands of years. By 2000 BCE, this type of veggie culture in the West African forest, where people lived alongside river banks and in clearings, had given place to more organized root agriculture. It took around 2000 years for cereal cultivation to spread to the savanna regions of East, Central and even Southern Africa. The spread of farmers who used iron from West Africa across much of the continent coincided with this occurrence. Africans were able to clear woods on a vast scale thanks to the iron technology. Farmers who used iron had crossed the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers into southern Africa within a few generations. When European farmers moved into South Africa's eastern Cape province in the 18th century, their descendants were still moving south. The origin and development of agrarian techniques, including the domestication of plants and animals in the Southwest Asia, and its transmission to different parts of the world, and the regional growth of certain species of plants, as discussed in some previous lectures, point to the importance of these transformations that revolutionized the human life during the Neolithic times. This topic was dealt in 3 lectures. Now to sum up the discussion related to the emergence of agriculture, it can be said that the eastern Mediterranean coast the Zagros Mountains and the Anatolia all saw autonomous cultural development in the agrarian history up until around 6000 BCE. Herding and agriculture independently developed in each region. They were not isolated from one another at all. There were frequent economic exchanges between the two regions, exchanges that may have facilitated the spread of pottery, herding, cereal crops, religious ideas, and other innovations. In ancient Southwest Asia, well-developed barter networks eventually helped disseminate economic and technological breakthroughs, which is why identical developments and intensifications of agricultural production occurred around the same time in several locations. The new economics had taken hold as the cornerstones of the human diet in Southwest Asia by 6000 BCE. Settlement patterns saw significant modifications. After farming became prevalent and agriculture was productive enough to feed many more people, sustained population expansion therefore began. Human communities created new systems for social control, conflict resolution, and the control of the use and inheritance of land throughout this period of great social transformation. But for the most part, the new societies continued to be egalitarian, with their economics centered on the capacities of the nuclear family and the home. The plaster skulls from Ain Ghazal, Jericho, and other Neolithic sites, as well as their intricate rituals and ancestor cults, demonstrate that farmers had already established the relationship between the living and the spiritual worlds, the world of fertile soil, abundant crops, and revered ancestors. With this, we have come to the end of today's lecture. I hope you have enjoyed it. Thank you so much.